Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome James Tobin in support of Master of His Fate in conversation this evening with Dr. Allida Black. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase Master of His Fate from Literati Bookstore. There's also links to purchase in the description right below if you are watching us on YouTube. But if you're watching live, you can submit questions for the Q&A portion using the Q&A feature available to you at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. And now I will introduce tonight's author and our moderator. James Tobin is an award-winning biographer and the author of the adult book, The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency, as well as the children's books, The Very Inappropriate Word and Sue McDonald Had a Book. He won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography for Ernie Pyle's War, and the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award for To Conquer the Air, The Wright Brothers, and The Great Race for Flight. He teaches narrative nonfiction in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And Dr. Allida Black is a distinguished visiting scholar at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. She received her PhD from the George Washington University, where she serves as editor emeritus of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project and research professor of history and international affairs. They can't hear you, but they can sense you through the powers of the internet. So please join me in welcoming James Tobin and Dr. Allida Black into your living rooms.
Here we are.
Yeah. So, Jim, before you read, I just have to tell the world that I must have read at least 100 books on FDR. And I've read more bad work on FDR and polio than I can count. And I am in awe of this book. And we'll talk about why, but I know that you were going to read a section that's a really pivotal part of the book for our audience, and then we can go back and pick it apart. How about that?
That'll be easy. You're way too kind, but thank you, Allida. To hear that from you, who I consider one of the great Roosevelt experts in the world, that obviously means a lot. So you suggested that maybe I think about reading something, and I picked a short passage, a couple pages, that describes FDR in 1924, 3 years after he contracted polio, and had been struggling to make a physical comeback with great difficulty, and everybody figured was out of politics for good. But Governor Al Smith of New York was running for president in that year, and he chose FDR to be his sort of trophy national campaign manager, and also to give the nominating speech for Smith at the Democratic National Convention at Madison Square Garden in New York. The very hot summer of 1924, a very contentious convention. And so this was to be FDR's first public appearance after having contracted this paralyzing illness. He was still very shaky getting up on his feet. He used crutches. He had developed a lot of strength in his upper body, but very little in his legs. And so this was a struggle just to get to the microphone at Madison Square Garden. He and his oldest son, Jimmy, who was his sort of physical a body man at this point, had prepared for weeks, practicing the walk just to get from the chair over to the rostrum across the speaker's platform. And so this describes what happened that day. It was not yet noon on June 27th, 1924, but the cavernous hall of Madison Square Garden was already roasting. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey's circus had just departed, so the powerful odors of elephants and lions still hung heavy in the damp air. FDR and Jimmy had arrived early, bringing the wheelchair so that FDR could move around and talk with the Democratic delegates gathering on the vast floor of the arena. Up in the galleries, thousands of raucous New Yorkers were starting to yell for their hero, Al Smith. Jimmy could see the beads of sweat rolling down his father's neck. Jimmy was, Allida, 16 at this point, I think. With many people still milling in the aisles, few noticed when two strong men lifted Roosevelt off his feet and hustled him up the steps to the broad speaker's platform where party leaders were standing, talking, finding their own chairs. Using crutches, with Jimmy standing by, FDR got to his seat. That was no simple thing, of course, not with the braces that held his legs rigid under his trousers. In a quick series of moves he had performed many times, he pivoted to turn his back to his chair. Then he and Jimmy gripped each other by the arms. Slowly, they lowered FDR until he was sitting with his legs locked straight in front of him. Then he reached behind his knees, undid the locks on the braces, and pulled his knees up. The man seated next to him was Joseph Guffey of Pennsylvania, an oil company executive who, like FDR, had been a loyal backer of Woodrow Wilson. FDR put a hand to Guffey's ear and whispered, "Joe, go up to the pulpit and shake it, will you?" Guffey gave him a puzzled look. "Why?" FDR said, "I want to see if it will surely support my weight." Guffey got it now. He went over to the lectern and gave it a hard nudge. It was heavy. FDR could lean against it without pushing it over. Finally, his name was announced. The crowd settled. Jimmy and his dad now repeated their act in reverse. Legs straight, braces locked at the knees, a quick lift, and FDR was standing. 4 years earlier, at the Democrats' National Convention in San Francisco, many of these same delegates had seen Franklin Roosevelt for the first time. He had been a tall, striking young man of 38 who had seized the big banner of the New York delegation and run to the front of the hall, leading a show of support for the retiring President Wilson, who'd been weakened by a stroke. Now here he was before them again, the same Franklin Roosevelt, yet different. His legs looked flimsy and unnaturally stiff under his trousers. They saw him grasp his crutches and begin to move. With each step, he carefully placed the crutches in front of him, then pulled his legs along. Everybody was holding their breath, said Francis Perkins. Perkins was a close friend of the Roosevelts, a labor leader who later became FDR's Secretary of Labor. Continuing the quote of hers, "The old line politicians remembered him as a very vigorous young man at the previous convention, but here was this terribly crippled person, getting himself to the platform somehow, looking so pale, so thin, so delicate. One step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He did not fall. 6 steps, 7. He let go of his left crutch and seized the edge of the lectern. With his right, he held down the pages of his speech. Normally, a politician would toss up his hands and wave to the crowd. But if Roosevelt tried that now, he would crash to the floor. So instead, he tossed up his head, the old gesture that Francis Perkins had always remembered, and smiled a great wide smile. The crowd exploded. "It just tore the place to pieces," Perkins said. When the long roar finally faded, FDR began to speak. It was the same strong voice they remembered, a cultured East Coast voice. He told the vast crowd that ordinary New Yorkers adored Al Smith. "Ask anyone when you leave this session. Ask the woman who serves you in the shop, the banker who cashes your check, the man who runs your elevator, the clerk in your hotel." Perkins, seated nearby, was watching FDR closely. Even as his voice rang through the hall, she could see his body trembling. The hand holding the pages of his speech on top of the lectern, quote, was literally shaking because of the extreme pain and tension with which he held himself up to make that speech, she said. He is first in the affections of the people of this state, the man who has twice been honored with election to the governorship. FDR scorned the people who had been whispering that Smith, as a Catholic, could not be a loyal American. He called on his party, quote, to be true to ourselves and put from our hearts and minds every sordid consideration, every ignoble personal prejudice. He said Smith fought for the good of common people. He said no other Democrat was more feared by Republicans. He is the happy warrior of the political battlefield, this man of destiny, whom our state proudly dedicates to the nation, our own Alfred E. Smith. Watching from the press gallery was the famous Will Rogers, a comedian, columnist, and actor, whose funny writings on public affairs were read all over the country. When FDR called out Smith's name, Rogers wrote, quote, you would have thought somebody had thrown a wildcat in your face. The galleries went wild. This is when political conventions really were political conventions. The enormous crowd whistled and roared for a full hour. For Al Smith, yes, but also for the electrifying performance given by the man who had returned from the edge of the grave. When Governor Smith had finished his own speech, more people wanted to talk to Roosevelt than to the governor himself. Some were whispering that it ought to be Roosevelt getting the nomination for president, not Smith. Hell, it's not legs we want in the White House, said one delegate. It's brains. That evening, as FDR rested back at the house on East 65th Street, he heard one of the family's closest friends, Marion Dickerman, come in through the front door downstairs. He called for her to come and see him. He threw his arms up and cried, Marion, I did it.
I just love that passage, Jim. And for those of you who don't really know what effort that took, one of the glories of Jim's book is that he puts you in the pain without the pity. I mean, it really is an extraordinary accomplishment, I think, Jim. And so one of the things that that I want to talk about, and then we'll pick up the Al Smith speech in a minute. But, you know, you did a marvelous adult book on FDR and polio, the man he became. I mean, it was fabulous. So why would you do a young adult middle reader book? I mean, why do FDR and polio and with such candor?
Well, I guess there are a couple of reasons. I loved books like this when I was a kid. I loved to read biography written for kids when I was young. That's how I got interested in history. So the idea of doing a book of this kind appealed to me a lot. I thought that the story would appeal to kids at the age when they're starting to become more sophisticated about what politics is all about, what science is all about. There's a lot of science in the book, as you know. And the thing is, one selfish reason is I just never got tired of this story. And after I was done with the adult book, I had trouble setting the topic aside. And I liked the idea of the challenge of boiling the story down to its essentials, so that kids would understand it and follow both the politics and the scientific part. That seemed like an interesting challenge for somebody who, like me, thinks about what makes a good story. And I thought there was a way that I could, like I say, just distill the story to its essential parts. I don't know if I've done that or not, but that's what I was shooting for, and that's what appealed to me about doing it.
Well, what struck me, and the one thing I'll quibble with you, my friend, about is that, I mean, I found it engrossing. Judy, my spouse, found it engrossing. You know, we've gotten people up and down our street to look at this book. And we're not kids. So it may be a young adult book, but I think there's a wider audience for that, because which leads me into my next point. You do not dumb this down. In fact, your discussion of the science behind polio, of how the body works, of the pain that FDR went through, what that did to him physically. I mean, there are times I could feel it in a way when I read this that I didn't feel it in more adult, in more clinical books. But I want to go back to how you decided what to put in the book and the integrity of your language. I mean, the book starts with an intro on what a biography is and what sources are and how to trust and not to trust. Now, I taught biography and history, more years than I want to count.
I know it.
And if I was still in the classroom, I would use your piece. Because your discussion of the use of crippled is so sets the tone for what you were trying to say in the book, and you were upfront about the rumors by 1932 that it's 1928, that it's not polio, it's syphilis, and so you're talking about venereal disease to young readers. You're talking about how people are stigmatized and how words are used. And you also give them a clear insight into political attacks and how you destroy an opponent. So my question to you is, did you get any pushback from your young editors, your young adult editors for being so candid?
The answer is that is no. I have a terrific editor for this book. Her name is Christy Ottaviano. She has her own imprint, had her own imprint at Henry Holt. She's just moved to Little Brown. She's a terrific editor. And she and I talked a lot about how to navigate our way through those things, but never with the sense that she was, putting a hand up and saying, oh, you must not talk about these terrible, adult truths about whispering campaigns and what is syphilis and a couple other things you mentioned that may well be problematic to the kinds of people who buy books for children, librarians and teachers, especially in certain states. We'll find out, and we'll find out whether the book keeps the attention of young readers. This is the first book in this genre that I've written. And so I was just feeling my way. I do trust my editor's instincts, and she felt that the target audience would be interested and was ready for frankness on this level. Books for kids in these age groups have changed a lot in recent years. That's one thing I've realized. Kids want the realism. After all, kids, you think about what kids are exposed to these days. They're ready for some frank talk about difficult issues like this. My greater fear is whether the politics will interest them and whether the I call it the science. I'm glad to hear you say that my description of the experience of the disease is interesting to you. I hope that kids will feel the same way.
Well, I thought the metaphors that you used about balls stuck in trees and all kinds of things really helped me visualize this. And talking about visualization, before we go to the next question, is that when I was talking about FDR and polio in my classes, I would say that by the time FDR was president, his upper thigh was, sorry, I wrote the wrong thing today, the width of my arm. And his whole body was in pain. And I don't think people really understood that and how he managed it until he was able to, come to grips with us, which brings me to my next question. And maybe this is too ethereal, but you're able to create these vivid scenes for him, like the scene before in your book, before he goes into Madison Square Garden.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a vivid scene of pain. They have to put his legs in casts. And then Catherine Lake is sitting there with a hammer and a wedge, going into his cast, and every nerve in his body was exposed. So you were able, in a remarkable way, I think, to talk about pain and other people's pity toward that pain without being condescending. It's not the whole Sunrise at Campobello shtick. It's not polio saved their marriage or polio ruined their marriage. It's about FDR, the man, fighting this disease. And so while the politics are fabulous, the politics, I don't mean that as a long-term Eleanor Roosevelt Democrat. I mean, in terms of your book,
I understand. Right.
It's not a political treatise. It's on the man fighting this. It's not about how this affects his marriage. It's not about how it affects his political philosophy. It's how this man learns to lead in his own right for himself. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment. Did you set out to write it that way?
Gosh, I just thank you again, Allida. You're being so nice. It's certainly true that I wanted to try as best I could to communicate the experience of the onset, the pain that he was in. More than that, the bewilderment about what had gone wrong. How could this possibly have happened? And then his impatient nature, straining against this long period of waiting to see how much muscle he would recover and so forth. So, and FDR himself, this was one of the most difficult parts of both of these books, is that FDR said very little about his own experience on these matters. You have to glean it from what other people said, eyewitnesses, and from the experience of other people who had been through the same thing with polio and the recovery from polio. It's interesting. I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about the way so many treatments have sort of looked at Roosevelt's experience with pity. And that was the key thing that he was fighting against in his effort to recover politically. Pity was poison for him. If he was going to be pitied by people, he would never be able to make it as an elected, as a candidate for elective office. And so many of the traits that we see in Roosevelt during this period, I think, some of which are not pleasant to look at, his pushing people away in some cases, and his silence about his condition, had much more to do not with covering up the state of his body, which is the way it's been handed down to us in recent decades, but with pushing away the pitiful stare or the pitying stare. That could not be, and what he wanted to do was become president of the United States. So what he had to do was push away that stigma, that sense that he was lesser. There are wonderful accounts written by people who have been through this kind of deep disability about the way one is made into the other by normally able people. And boy, that was, he did everything he could to disable people from taking that view of him, if you will.
And so did Eleanor, in a way. But so, which brings me to another disjointed Allida question, but it's sort of a sequitur. And you and I guess 15 years ago, one night on my back porch, got into this long conversation about FDR's respect for women. You know, that he was a flirt, he was a hunk, but he is a man who begged Frances Perkins to come in and be his Secretary of Labor, who met every condition she, put upon him to take that condition.
Mhm.
His mother was strong. Eleanor grew into a strong voice in her own right. And this is a question that I have to ask you, that it just dawned on me as I reread part of the book last night, was that the people that had the most influence really on FDR's health and his practical ability to cope and master this disease were women, not his doctors, but his nurses. Catherine Lake, Wilhelmina Wright, who comes from, you talk about in great detail, how she comes from Boston to New York. And she really is sort of the pioneer or the precursor, if you would say, to physical therapy. And then you get, Helena Mahoney, or just Mahoney, as she's known
Right.
in Warm Springs, who I always envision as some type of Kathy Bates character, where you just,
Who played her? Who played her?
yeah, I mean, I thought it was perfect casting. It was
It was
just
good
like,
casting.
do
Right.
not mess with me. So do you think I'm right that FDR looked at these three women and trusted them more than he did his doctors?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Relied on them. I mean, I think that what's her name? Alice Plastridge.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about his doctors. Robert Lovett, especially the orthopedist who first diagnosed him and then treated him for several years. Like, FDR would sit there and listen to Lovett, and he didn't pay any attention to what Lovett said. Now, it ultimately, the physical therapists, the women physical therapists who finally got through to him were giving him the same advice that Lovett had, but he was ready to hear it from them after years of trying and failing to do it his own way. So yeah, it's very interesting. It's true, and you have to look at the role that his mother played in his life.
Yeah.
A very strong woman. Now, there's a lot of mythology about Sarah Roosevelt and their relationship, that he was a mama's boy and so forth. It's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that. But boy, he grew up, in the shadow of a woman who ran her own estate, who knew her own mind. That just didn't trouble him.
Yeah.
He didn't have to get the best of women.
Yeah. And his longtime secretary and right hand, Missy Hand, I mean, to quote her, as you do repeatedly through the end of the book, "Don't you dare, Franklin, don't you dare." So I just, I thought it, I don't think FDR gets enough credit really for his ability to elevate and listen to and respect strong women, because God knows he was a flirt. I mean, he flirted with every woman that walked by him.
Oh, sure.
But
somebody said of Bill Clinton, could be said of FDR. He flirted with women, he flirted with men, he flirted with dogs. But now let me ask you, as you watched my characterization of Eleanor through the book, and she does not play as large a role as she might.
No.
What did you think about that?
Okay, well, you have two sentences about their marriage that blew me away so much. I got so mad, I put the book down and had to go back. And I came back and said to Judy, I have spent 10 years on this marriage, and he has done it in two sentences.
I don't believe that.
No, it's true. Honest to God, we can bring Judy up from downstairs.
Which sentence?
So I think one of the reasons that I liked this book is that you busted this sunrise at Campobello shroud, that has interpreted their relationships for so long. And they were, after Campobello, they were more like brother and big sister, than they were husband and wife. And that, and they loved each other in different ways, as you say. And your succinct characterization of that was quite powerful. I mean, and it was spot on, Jim. I mean, it really was. And maybe it's because there's another biography out there now that's written by a very nice man, but totally doesn't get their relationships at all.
I know which one you mean. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, well, don't. So, so, for me to see that, and to see when Eleanor comes into the story, Eleanor is there for a reason. And it's not because, I haven't talked about Eleanor in 6 pages, I'm going to throw her in. I mean, you're able to focus on her keeping his name in front of New York State politicians while he's, on the houseboat in Florida, or hanging out at Warm Springs, or in Boston in rehab. But it's not eyes and ears. It's Eleanor doing her own thing. Right. And that is a huge tribute, Jim, and you need a big shout out for that.
Well, it's the women biographers, you included, who have made that clear. Well, I mean, we know that because of you and Blanche Wiesen-Cook, But
not many people do that. And I just, so I want to throw a question back at you about them, since we're talking about the two of them. In both Master of His Fate and the earlier adult version, although I think this is an adult version too, but we can fight about that over drinks, you construct a pretty honest picture of their relationship. I mean, in few words, but readers see that. So my question to you is, what did you learn about FDR and Eleanor writing both of these books? Because you had to tackle it, with the man he became, and you had to make it succinct and accessible.
Yeah.
In Master of His Fate.
Well,
is that a fair question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking about the way I would answer it. I guess the thing that I had never really understood, and then I want to see if you think this is true. And another way that Eleanor's effect on him is talked about is, she stoked his ambition. Well, nobody needed to stoke Franklin Roosevelt's ambition.
Yeah.
And in fact, what I came to realize was that really she put the brakes on at every stage from polio onward. She, when he decided I'm gonna try and make a comeback politically, she supported that, not because she thought he could. I think it's pretty clear. This is one of the things that comes through. Her correspondence is very good through these years. She makes it clear she thinks that's a crazy idea, basically, but that it will be good for him. She does it for him to keep his mind engaged in politics, which she knows he loves above all other things. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't want to see, and I think this is a Sarah thing too, she doesn't want to see him go back to Hyde Park and sit there.
Oh my God, no.
Under his
no way.
Yeah.
No way.
And there's my doorbell, but I'm not going to answer it.
Okay.
So I mean, I think that's critical. And then she's really very skeptical about buying Warm Springs. She thinks that's a dumb idea. And
well, he was the worst businessman in the history of the universe.
Right.
I mean, he blew his tree farm. He lost money on that. I mean, everything he invested in, he lost money. And he's going to put, as you point out, 2/3 of the family income, I mean, inheritance into this thing.
And here it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away.
Yeah.
He's got kids in school. Now, the thing is, he made it work.
Yeah, he did make it work. And the thing,
business-wise, not so much, but he made it into this extraordinary place, and had a, just look at the, what came out of it, the March of Dimes.
Oh my God, it's
The
extraordinary.
polio vaccine. Yeah. Warm Springs is an extraordinary achievement.
Mhm.
And it's because he had a crazy idea.
And because he knew how to make it work.
Yeah.
Because he just would not take no. And not take no in a sense of being irrational, but it's like an early version of bold, persistent experimentation.
That's exactly
which is his great line in the 1932 campaign. I mean, that's what Warm Springs was bold, persistent experimentation. But
and of course, that's the way he treated his own polio.
Absolutely.
Try this, and if it doesn't work, you try that. I mean, all of us, I remember one day I thought, oh my God, it's the New Deal. It's the New Deal.
It is the New Deal. But what's good about your book is that you don't write the book this way. It's not this is why FDR became,
right. Right. No, I don't buy that. Right.
And no, I don't either. I think there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah.
But I do think to go back to Eleanor and politics and,
sure.
Your earlier point, I think the real pivotal moment in the book, the bookend, if you will, to the 1924 speech is the 1928 phone call with Al Smith, because Eleanor wants him to be political. Eleanor wants him to run. And Eleanor is very close to Al Smith.
Now wait a minute. Because I'm agnostic on that point. You think she wanted him to run for governor?
No, I think she wants him to run for president later.
But
I think by 1928, when they have that phone call, and for the viewers that are here, FDR does not want to run in 28. Al Smith is a Catholic. He's opposed to prohibition. He smokes cigars. He's from the east side of New York. He's alienated the South, which is the Democratic stronghold. My God, he's a Catholic. He's for booze, and he talks with a funny accent, and he's all for immigrants. I mean, how anti-South can you be, says this child from Memphis. And then, so Eleanor knows that Franklin will be of help to Smith on the ticket. And she really wants Smith to win, not just because she believes in Smith, but because she is anti-Hoover. And what we're just beginning to unpack about Eleanor is her response to Hoover making people lie down side by side like sandbags in the Great Mississippi Flood. I'm just beginning to see how Eleanor knew about that. I see. So, I mean, I think that the combination of Eleanor's fear of Smith losing and her not doing everything she could to help him, because she's with the Democratic National Committee then, and Belle Moskowitz writes Al Smith, and as you know, and says, we must have FDR on the ticket because his wife is more known among the party faithful than anybody in the state. So there's that dance between the two of them. That's what's good for the country and what's good for both of them.
Yeah.
Without being how to line my pocket.
Boy,
and that's
that some layers that I wish I'd had. That's great stuff.
But you say this, Jim, you set it up so people understand this. So before we go to questions, because I know we're running over, I have a final easy out of the ballpark question.
Okay.
What do you want people to learn about FDR and polio and politics from reading your book?
Oh, it's really this, just sort of this, at base, I think it's a great model for how to live. I dedicated the book to our two grandchildren, and I said, their names are Ben and Lucy Keller, and I said to Ben and Lucy, remember this story when someone says, you'll never be able to do that. And I think that's something we all have to keep in mind in our bad moments and when we've had our worst setbacks. So that's what I hope that, kids read, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old reading this book would take away from it. Is that
Or
sort of
an 18-year-old in panic about, am I going to go to school or not?
Yeah.
Or how am I going to get the money to go?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's a good book, Jim.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's see what our listeners have.
All right.
John,
All right.
you have questions for us?
We do. We have some questions. First question, a viewer writes, how much variance between the quote unquote young reader's book and The Man He Became? And the follow-up being, does the young reader book have more dialogue, impassioned speaking, etc.? So maybe a bit of the process of adaptation.
Well, it's a great question. It's one I thought and worried about a lot. How should it be different? And I said at the beginning, I thought at the start, it's all about the story. Find the human story that runs through this whole episode. And so I thought a lot about that. What's I don't know. It's hard now, both books mixed together in my head. It's hard now to remember how much difference there is. But it's not a matter of more dialogue in the children's book. You can't make up dialogue that didn't happen. I wrote scenes, as we call them, in the narrative business where I could, but there isn't much dialogue. There are a few things. The one that Allida mentioned just now, where Smith gets FDR on the phone to try to just strong arm him into running for governor in 1928, when FDR is determined not to, because he thinks that Smith is going to lose, and therefore the gubernatorial candidate will lose too. That's a real dialogue that we have, thanks to some great research from the great Roosevelt biographer Jeffrey Ward. But there isn't too much of that. So, I just tried to explain the medical part and the political part at its basic level. I'm thinking of Elmore Leonard, who said, how most authors write a long book and then they have to think about the boring parts. He said, I just leave the boring parts out. So that's what I try to do in the kids' version.
Melanie writes, did you read the series which included such books as Young Abe Lincoln and also some of the landmark series of bios?
I think I know who that might be. This is probably my sister Melanie, who watched me doing the very thing she's asking about. The books that I loved the most is a series called Childhood of Famous Americans. Mm-hmm. And that's just a stunning series. It's still in print, I think. Mm-hmm. And I read a ton of those. First sort of, a real chapter book that I read was Paul Revere, Boy of Old Boston. I remember that. Wilbur and Orville Wright, Boys with Wings. So those really stuck with me. I read some of the landmarks, but it's funny, you look back at the landmark books now, that's the famous series of history and biography for children. But a lot of that was written by rather prominent authors who had not written for children before. McKinley Cantor, for instance, and so it was over my head when I would try those books sometimes.
Just a reminder too, if you're watching, that we still have time for a few more questions. So if you have some, please feel free to submit them using the audience Q&A feature in the webinar. Cynthia writes, James, can you tell us what you're working on now?
No, I'm afraid I cannot. I do have a new project. but I got to keep it under wraps for now.
Okay.
Great. All right. This is a loaded question, and I think perhaps both of you might need to weigh in on this.
Okay.
Claire asks, be honest, Dad. Who do you like better, FDR or Eleanor?
Oh man, I'm taking Claire to dinner, Jim.
Well, I don't know if she realizes it, but Allida will know the answer. That's a very easy question to answer. Eleanor Roosevelt is by far the person you'd prefer to spend time with. You know, you spend a lot of time with FDR, Allida, I bet you'd feel the same way.
Yeah.
He's a pretty chilly character.
Yeah.
For all of all the appearance of this warm, jovial person. And he did have a great sense of humor. Absolutely the most charming person you could meet. But if you want somebody to stick with you through thin and thin and just to spend time with, it's Eleanor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I also think too, okay, I'm going to get in trouble here. I don't think you have to like the president of the United States. I think the president of the United States needs to like Americans.
Yeah.
And I think that for all of FDR's wiles and inconsistencies, there was no doubt that he loved the American people. But I just have to say one thing, because it's the greatest political put down of all time. It's that Herbert Hoover in 1932 said that FDR had the political convictions of a chameleon on plaid.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with that. But we expect him, because he went to political war on so many things, that when he doesn't, it's glaring. I mean, internment is glaring. Anti-lynching is glaring. Not listening to Eleanor and including healthcare and Social Security. Now it probably would have tanked Social Security. We don't know, but imagine what would have happened if healthcare was included in Social Security. But he did understand a fundamental concept of rights, I think, that he hasn't gotten credit for. And I know this is outside the scope of your book, but John, you opened the floodgate here.
Right.
I do think that if you look at the For Freedom speech, and if you look at the Economic Bill of Rights speech,
right,
it wasn't just enough to fight against fascism, or to fight for what America used to be, until the Depression came in. It's to fight for what America could be. And I think
that's the transformation.
That's exactly what FDR and Eleanor understood in their dynamic. Now, they fought a lot about how to do it, but they never doubted that.
Yeah. And to take it back to the personal level too, and this is where some of FDR's complexity comes in. Robert Sherwood, the great playwright who was one of his speechwriters, said, I looked and looked into that forest, that deep forested interior, and I never could figure out what was going on in there. But FDR was truly interested in people. He really was. Anybody who came in to the Oval Office, people he met out on the stump when he was campaigning, he made a connection with people, and it wasn't artificial. Yeah. So although he wasn't great with his children, worshipped him, but he wasn't a great father. He certainly was not a great husband. He used people that he was close to, but I think you're right, Allida. He did also care about individuals and was fascinated by individual lives.
That's it. There's this big dichotomy, that's so interesting. And to me, that comes through in this book.
Well,
it comes through in how FDR is trying to manage his feelings to do what he needs to do, to deal with this horrific literally muscle crunching, muscle eroding, needle pained disease.
Yeah.
And but you do that without getting into psychobabble. And I'm so sick of psychobabble, I could lose my lunch in a trash can. And so, because you give people the information and let people make their own decisions, which is what you're able to do in a lot of this. And while I have the floor, I'm going to circle back to your point about Jeff Ward. And I want to tell the audience that it's not just me who raves about this book. The dust jacket quote is from Jeff Ward, who said, Franklin Roosevelt will always remain a compelling if controversial figure. But as James Tobin's Master of His Fate elegantly demonstrates, no one can deny the gallantry with which he learned to live with a handicap that would have crushed a less determined man, or hope that this example can kindle in anyone facing a similar challenge. I wish I had read this book when polio hit me 70 odd years ago. And this comes from a man who has written the definitive biography of the formative years of FDR. And I love Jeff Ward. He's a man whose respect I always want to have, and a historian that I go to when I'm confused or I want to spar.
Well, he scares me.
And
So, but I'll tell you,
he's fab. And for have him say that about you, you need to go to bed tonight with a smile on your face.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that happened when we sent the book to him, hoping that he would write that blurb, and it was absolutely wonderful when he did. But what I was doing at the same time, it turned out, was using him as a fact checker. And boy, you couldn't have a better fact checker.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
I've been there, man.
He sent me some stuff that
I'm totally there.
I was awfully glad that he had read the book before it got published.
Yeah. Yeah.
We maybe have time for one more question. We did get a few more questions, so I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours, and thank you for submitting it. A viewer writes, why do you think FDR didn't record his thoughts about dealing with polio?
FDR was not a very introverted man. And I think of a terrific book, one of my favorite books, What It Takes, by Richard Ben Kramer, writing about the candidates in presidential campaign of 1988. He said, these guys don't get to this place, these guys, I shouldn't say just guys anymore, thank goodness. These people who make it to the top tier of American politics, they don't get there by looking inward and wondering, why am I doing this and what has been my experience? He was too busy trying to figure out how to become president. And I think he just wasn't very interested in himself in that way. I don't know. What do you think, Allida? He just didn't write about his own thoughts and feelings.
And Eleanor doesn't either. I mean, no. She'll, in all the, 20 something books she wrote, more than 8,000 columns, she doesn't do that. I mean, she'll throw a line away about my Griselda moods. Mm-hmm. And, she may have talked to her close friends about FDR, but not a lot.
Right.
Just they held their emotions close to their vest.
Right. They learned that, at their mother's laps. You did not talk about yourself. You didn't really think about yourself very much. You did your duty, did what you were supposed to do, as you saw your duty. And so, she said, he was a man of the 19th century, and in some ways she was a woman of the 19th century in that particular way.
And duty really did have duty and ambition.
Yeah.
Played a big role with both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, Eleanor, I think she's a saint, but not in the, long-suffering religious sense. I just think that she saw the worst the world could give, democracy in all of its failings. And she gave everything she had to make it work.
Right.
And that's what qualifies as a saint in my book.
I would call her, I would use the term Mahatma, the title for Gandhi, great soul, great soul.
Mm-hmm.
And she had the great soul in a way that FDR did not.
Yeah.
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 Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Allida said, Jim, that you and her could talk about the Roosevelts for 20 weeks, and I kind of would like to tune in for that. But
we'll make it a podcast. We'll just keep going.
Oh my God, that'd be a riot. Let's do it, Jim. That would be
truly
great.
Do that. Definitely.
Well, she does a lot more than
excerpts we should have put in the book,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. We so appreciate it. We hope we can have you in the store soon. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us tonight as well. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And we will see you at the next event. So take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So long.